Welcome to Building Better Relationships with Chuck and Barb Lewis, equipping listeners and viewers with the biblical tools to conquer the difficulties faced in this life. Chuck has practiced crisis intervention since the 1980s and has been in ministry together with his wife Barb for over 20 years. They've taken the countless lessons and the knowledge they've acquired and have put them into this life skills class to share with you. We hope this blesses you.
Well, hello again. This is Chuck and Barbara. And I always say your name, and
I'm
you're
the
supposed
Barbara
to say
side.
your name.
That's okay.
But anyway, we're Chuck and Barbara Lewis, and we are excited to be with you again today for this broadcast on healthy relationships,
Building better relationships.
Yes.
Chuck and Barbara Lewis.
You'd think I'd have that title down by now, but we're going to be talking today about a topic that I learned about years ago called boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first heard it, I thought, boundaries? What does that have to do with anything? But I found out, and we both have found out, that boundaries have everything to do with everything. Because people that have boundaries are the least angry people of all people.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Because there's not a lot of violations going on. So we're going to talk about what they are. And as you're watching this, maybe you could kind of assess where you are in your boundary life, or maybe you don't have boundaries. And hopefully we can teach you some things that's going to really help you to incorporate some good boundaries in your life. So let's start out by talking about what a boundary is.
Yeah, that's a good place to start.
Why don't you describe what a boundary is?
Okay.
As far as the
Well, an easy to understand physical boundary is like a fence around your yard.
or a property line.
A property line.
Yeah.
It marks what is your property.
Yes.
And, where your property ends
Mm-hmm.
and someone else begins.
Right.
A boundary you could think of with yourself is your skin. And, it's around yourself. It shows where you end and somebody else begins. What's your responsibility and what is someone else's responsibility? And I do want to show this book. This is the Boundary book that was written by Dr. Cloud and Townsend. And I bought this book 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So the cover might look a little different now. But it was actually one of the most important books I ever read next to my Bible. When I read it, I just thought there were so many things wrong with me because I didn't have any boundaries or understand boundaries. I'd never been taught about them. And I just felt like there was so many things about me that needed to be fixed. I felt kind of overwhelmed. But we just have to start where we are. But it did show me why I was angry about some things.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why don't you explain what the purpose of boundaries is?
Well, I mean, that is the purpose, really, is to avoid violations.
Yeah, to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, because we can either be a boundary buster or a boundary observer.
Mm-hmm.
And to observe somebody else's boundary, we don't have to agree with that boundary or have the same boundary.
Right.
But honor and respecting the other person is honoring their boundary, even if we don't agree with it.
Right.
I like the property line example because if I'm doing a landscaping project and I'm getting really close to my neighbor's property line, then I can even have the city come out and draw, paint a line exactly where my property is.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I go 20 feet over into his property and I'm digging up his yard and putting in my landscaping project, and he comes out there and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" "Well, I'm doing this project." Well, it's just fine if I'm on my side. But if I'm on his side now, I'm violating his property and his boundary. And so I like that example because we need to find out where the boundary lines are in our own life and basically when to say yes, when to say no, and how to take control of your life. Yeah. And I've talked to people about boundaries and they said, well, that just sounds like you're a control freak. You're just trying to control everybody with your boundary, but it's not a control thing. It's more of a protection thing
Right.
to
That's a good way to
protect
put it.
ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's to keep the bad out
Keep the bad
and
out.
keep the good in.
So give an example of the bad, keeping the bad out. Like you're talking about people that are saying insulting things,
Mm-hmm.
putting you down.
Right. Abuse.
Criticism.
Let's just say that someone is talking to you disrespectfully. It could be your child, your spouse, your friend, whatever. But you can say, "I will be in your presence as long as you can talk to me respectfully.
Right.
But as long as you're going to talk disrespectfully, I choose not to be in your presence."
Right.
So when you can talk to me respectfully in tone of voice and words, then we can continue this conversation.
See, that's so good because, again, we can't control that other person, but we're sending a clear message
Right.
of letting them know that we're not going to tolerate abuse. The minute abusive statements start, that's when we stop.
Mm-hmm.
Because the truth is, you and I are way too valuable to be abused and to be treated disrespectfully. We can say what we need to say, even if it's a corrective action,
Right.
without being abusive. See, and that's a session in itself. Is how do you talk about what's not working in a respectful way without being abusive?
Mm-hmm.
And some people think they can't say it unless it's harsh
Right.
or putting that person down.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want them to get the point. I want them to understand how I feel. Well, you can in a respectful way. Always be kind. What's the saying that you?
Just be kind all the time, no matter what.
No matter what. Yeah. And that's a choice. That's not a feeling. Well, I don't feel like being kind. I feel like telling them off. I feel like putting them in their place.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody needs to do it, all this stuff.
There's another one too. It's say what you mean what you say, and don't say it mean.
And don't say it mean. Yeah. So that's really setting a boundary on not saying it mean, basically.
Right.
Yeah. So how do you discover your own personal boundaries? Basically, it's when we're violated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that it used to bother me when my oldest daughter would take my bathing suit out of my drawer and borrow it without asking me. I didn't really understand why that bothered me until I read the boundary book, and I realized that was my own personal things that she should have asked before she did that. So that's a good indicator that your boundaries have been violated is resentment or anger. That tells you that something's wrong.
Yeah, I've had people say, well, I guess I'm just an angry person because I'm just angry all the time. And what we begin to do is discover all the violations. We start looking at, what violations are happening, like what you just mentioned about getting your things taken out of your drawer without permission. Anything that feels like a violation to you is usually a boundary busting situation.
Right.
But we've got to identify what our boundaries are before we can tell the other person that that's a boundary.
Right.
See, when I grew up without boundaries. I didn't hear the word boundaries mentioned. In fact, if I'd mentioned boundaries with my biological family, they probably would have thought that I joined a cult. They said, "Oh man, you're in a cult. You're gonna be totally deceived." But it wasn't that. It was just the fact that they didn't know what a boundary was. So there was a lot of boundary violations, going on.
Right.
So when you discover your boundaries, they're your boundaries, okay? That's something that you can own. I've had people say, well, I think, I've identified a boundary. Like for instance, if I meet for somebody for lunch and they're kind of accustomed to showing up late, and I say to them, well, I'll give you a 20-minute window, and if now we have cell phones, so if you're running late, I'd appreciate a call. And if you're not going to call me After 20 minutes, I'm going to leave. Wow, that's ridiculous. That's a stupid boundary. Well, that's not. That keeps me from feeling violated and feeling taken advantage of. Because what they're
Right.
really saying is their time is more important than my time.
Right.
They're not honoring
Yeah.
my time.
Yeah, it's
So
disrespectful.
it's very disrespectful. And they can make fun of that. And I've had to make fun of that and say, oh my gosh, you're just this, you're just that. But if I draw that boundary, that keeps me from feeling angry and feeling used and abused.
Right.
See, so many people feel abused in this country and feel like they can't do a thing about it. Of course, all over the world, for that matter, they're feeling that way, and they are, because the word boundaries is probably not even talked about. If we were talking to a lot of people around the world right now, if they were in this room, they'd say, I don't even know what a boundary is. What are you talking about? See? So we've got to discover what our boundaries are. And once you discover them, like I read that book with Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend also. And that was a life changer for me.
I felt it was for me too.
Oh my gosh. Changed my, but the thing is, I had to keep learning about the boundaries.
It's a journey.
Keep incorporating them. Yeah. And they're not going to happen automatically. You don't get a book like that and read it one night, and then the next day you have all these kind of boundaries.
Boy, that's for sure.
You have to practice the boundaries. I've taught people how to say no. They felt like they couldn't say no.
That's a good point, because no is a boundary,
Well,
and no can be a complete sentence.
Right.
And whether or not someone can hear your no is a good indication, excuse me, of whether or not that's a healthy relationship.
Yes.
Somebody that can't hear your no has a character defect. And so it's just a good gauge of whether or not this is a healthy relationship or not, whether or not they can hear your no.
Well, you can see how controlling they are if they can't hear your no. See,
Right.
honoring your no doesn't mean I agree with your no.
Right.
I might not understand your no at all, but I have to honor that if I'm going to choose to have a relationship that's not based on power and control.
Right. And that is such a good point, because boundaries are to take care of you. They're not to get other people's approval. And everyone's boundaries don't need to be the same.
Right.
And boundaries are changeable too. It's like that fence that's around your property has a gate, and you can choose to open that gate
Yes.
and let things in, people in or whatever, or you can choose to close that gate to keep things out.
So a boundary is a gate. It's not a wall.
Right. It's not for isolation.
It doesn't isolate you.
Right.
Yeah, because I mean, you might be hearing this today and say, well, yeah, okay, if I draw boundaries, I'm going to live in this fort, and there's going to be walls around me, and I'm not going to be able to go anywhere to keep from being violated, because if I go outside of my walls, then I open the door to violation.
Right.
But it's to protect you. It's to keep you from being violated. So I worked with a lady one time that she could not say no. She'd try to say no, and she'd get close to it, and she'd end up going, okay. And that would make her so irritated, that she just couldn't say no. So the fact is, it's a process of learning how to practice saying no. So I had her practice, and she got to the point where she worked that, what I call the no muscle, to where she could really say no, and she got pretty good at it. She didn't get abusive with it, but she got good at being able to say no. And it's so empowering when we can say no when we need to and say yes when we need to. And really, it's up to us. It's not waiting for the other person to change all the time before we can say no.
And sometimes we do the pendulum swing. We're over here and we have no boundaries at all. We can't say no.
Right.
And then we swing way over where our boundaries are too hard, and we just scream, no!
Yeah, right.
And really, we need to be in the middle and be able to say it, not angry. In fact, sometimes anger is the only boundary someone can have. They can't even have a boundary until they're so angry.
So angry.
And the goal of boundaries, though, is to be in balance and be able to say no so that you don't have to get angry.
Right, right. So if we keep allowing violations to keep reoccurring, we're just going to get angrier and angrier, and then usually there's a major blow up. It's called build up, blow up, build up, blow up.
Right.
And that's a cycle that starts happening.
Right.
So we want to help you to look at what boundaries are needed in your life, and are you a boundary observer or a boundary buster? Do you bust other people's boundaries with your aggressive ways of wanting to have it your way? I had a woman say one time, she said, I married Mr. Right. I just didn't know his first name was Always. And so that would be a major boundary buster right there. But it's to empower you and equip you with tools to say yes when you need to and no when you need to. So think about the people in your life right now that you're saying yes to that you need to be saying no to.
Yeah, there's a couple things I'd like to say about boundaries before we get to the end. And that is, what things do we need to own of our own that we need to take responsibility for? And that is our own feelings, our own attitudes and beliefs, your behaviors, choices, our values, our limits, our thoughts and our desires, our own finances. We'll talk about that a little bit more in another session. But also, people will have boundaries, whether they do them overtly or covertly. And overt is having your boundaries out in the open, where you communicate what they are. You let people know what you will do and what you won't do, what you'll tolerate and what you won't. You're stating them clearly with words and actions, openly, hopefully spoken in love. But covert boundaries are something people do when they don't have the courage to say what their boundary is. And what they'll do, some covert boundaries examples is withdrawing, triangulation, where I tell you about a problem I'm having with someone else because I'm afraid to tell the someone else what's going on. So that's triangulation. It doesn't solve anything. It's not a healthy way to do it. But also pouting can be a boundary. Passive aggressive behavior, where you try to pay somebody back for something they did because you don't have the courage to tell them openly what they did that violated you. Destructive relationships. So it's important that we learn to have our boundaries clearly and out in the open so people know what to expect, know where they stand with us, and not do them in the unhealthy way, the passive aggressive way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we don't talk about what's not working, we internalize a lot of those feelings, and it can cause a lot of major health problems.
It can.
Yeah. So these tools that we talk about are tools that we practice in our relationship so that we can be healthy emotionally, physically, spiritually, in every way. And we're trying to pass those on to you so that you can have the same experience. Because, this life can be pretty neat and exciting if we're doing this life in a healthy way. But boy, if it's unhealthy and we're physically sick all the time because we're stressed out all the time, we're not drawing good boundaries, so we're violating our own boundaries all the time because we don't even know what our boundaries are. We have a lot of fear of rejections, so we don't set the the boundaries up in relationships,
Right.
and we don't have a voice. We lose our voice, basically. And that leads to a lot of anger and resentment.
Right.
So disapproval is another thing that happens with people that are afraid to draw boundaries.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what that's like.
Yeah, there's reasons why people don't set boundaries. There's the internal conflict of fear of loss of love, fear of disapproval, fear of conflict is probably the biggest one for me. But fear of rejection. So those are things that are inside you
Right.
that are keeping you from drawing boundaries on other people.
So we've got to close today, but know that when you set boundaries, you're not doing that to get other people's approval. You're doing the boundaries for you.
Right.
And so we encourage you, to write your comments in on the lower part of this video, and we'll address those comments with you. If you've got situations going on, as other people read those comments, that will help them as well. And we appreciate you being with us today. Join us again next time, and we'll see you again.
If you are blessed by this ministry, please subscribe, like, and share. You can also make donations at chucklewisministries.com. Join us to keep uncovering the tools to build better relationships together. Let's do this again next week.